Right, good morning, everyone. We left off last week having just described King David's alarm clock system. Yes, remember, Julie has just remembered the harp, which was strategically placed above his bed. And of course, they knew their geography, these people, and they knew that the wind changes around midnight to a north wind, which would then rustle through the strings of the harp or the lyre and would start to play music. And it would wake up King David. And then he could do what he wanted to do, which was, we learned last time, it was to learn Torah. Okay, so that's where we left it last time. And we're now going to see, let's just admit a few more people. There we go. We're now going to see what actually happened when, after King David woke up at midnight, he did his learning, and then at a certain time, the day would begin. And as Julia said last week, he's obviously a very busy man. He's got to write all these Tehillim. He's got to wage war. He's got to, have affairs with other people's wives and things like that. So he's a busy man. And so he has to get up at midnight. And when that's the time when he's got to do his learning. So let's go and see what happens after that. Remember, the whole point of this little exercise, I can just remind you, the whole point of this is to bring a proof that we need the Sanhedrin's permission for a war, a milchemet reshut, a discretionary war. That's what this whole thing is about. Previously, we had brought a proof from where we brought a proof from. We brought a proof from the past from, I think it was Rabbabahu or somebody like that, wasn't it? Yeah. Have a look. He brought a proof from. That's right. V'chol b'nei Yisrael ito v'chol ha'ida. This was the appointment of Yehoshua. That's where he brought it from. The appointment of Yehoshua. It was done in front of all b'nei Yisrael ito, with him, and we said that was the Kohen who was the special Kohen for the war, who was anointed for the war. I thought that was a little bit of a schlep to say that V'chol b'nei Yisrael means the special Kohen, and then it said V'chol ha'ida. That was a little bit more understandable because we've used that word Eidah, congregation, to mean a Sanhedrin in the past. But then we disproved that because we said, well, maybe this is just to teach us that the Sanhedrin are allowed to approach the Urim B'tumim, that the breastplate of the Kohen Gadol, which you would light up with magic numbers and letters to give answers from a Kodesh Baruch. So we tried again, and it was Rav Acha bar Bizna who told us this story of the alarm clock of David. Let's just go from here. Let's share the screen, since I'm talking about here and you don't have a clue what I'm talking about. There we go.
Top of page 85.
There we go, top of page 85. Yeah, can you see it in the screen?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So, Ella, rather, Kihad Amar Rav Acha bar Bizna, Amar Rav Shimon Chasida. This is another attempt by Rav Acha bar Bizna in the name, or others say, in the name of Rabbi Shimon Chista. Kinor hayat talui lamala mimitato shel David. This harp or lyre was hung above the bed of David HaMelech. Kevan shegiach chatzot halayla, when midnight arrived, ruach tzefonit menashevet bo. The north wind would blow automatically on this harp, again, me elav. It would play on its own automatically. Miyad hayad David omed va'osek batorah. Immediately, David would rise from his bed and he would study Torah. Osek batorah. He would busy himself. Same word as esek. Modern Hebrew, an esek is a business. If you are an ish esek in modern Hebrew, you are a businessman. Okay. But osek batorah, he would busy himself with the Torah. When ad sha'ala amud hashachar, until the dawn would arrive. Allah, rise, amud hashachar. It's an interesting expression. We're used to just seeing this, it's a beautiful expression actually. Sha'ala.
The pillar of morning.
Amud, what's an amud?
It's a pillar.
A pillar, yeah, pillar. To stand. Hashachar, the morning. Same word as shacharit. Okay, so until the pillar of morning would rise. So it's basically, what do we say in English? The dawn rises. Okay, so it's the same expression, the dawn rises. So it would be a good translation here to say that he busied himself with Torah until the dawn rises, or the dawn rose. And then, Kevan sha'ala amud hashachar. Once dawn arose, then nichnasu chachmei Yisrael etzlo. The wise people of Israel would enter etzlo, to him. Eitzel means there isn't a translation in English for the word eitzel. There is in German, and there is in Yiddish, and there is in Yinglish. I'm sure you all know what Yinglish is. You'll find the German word for eitzel means buy, is buy, B-I-E. So in Hebrew, you would say, you are eating at my house. You would say, atem ochlim etzli. Okay, eitzel means at my house. And in German, you would say, essen die bei mir.
Yeah.
B-E-I. And you would say that in Yiddish as well. So what you find that people who speak Yinglish, who don't even know they're speaking Yinglish, you will find them saying, are you eating by me? You ever heard that from I'm sure your Avril Gatov, I'm sure your children use that expression.
In New York Jewry, that's very yeshivish.
Yes, very yeshivish.
It's only the Orthodox say that. The conservative, Reform, and liberal don't use it.
Yeah, you're quite right, Sharon. It's the same in the holy city of Manchester. The Orthodox people will use that expression. They're eating by me, and what they don't realise is that is not English. That is Yinglish, because the word by comes from German, B-I-E. It's not B-Y. It's B-I-E, and it's a good Yinglish expression, you are eating by me. But in Hebrew, there is actually a proper word for it, and it is eitzel.
We translated it as by my side, or by his side. By his side.
Where did it say that?
That's what Rabbi Balkin taught me, etzlo.
By his side.
By his side.
Yeah, okay, well, could be. But etzlo means by in Yiddish. Well, we don't have an English word for it, which is why we have to use the Yinglish word.
It's like the French chez.
Chez, that's right. Exactly the word chez in French. But there isn't an English equivalent. It's one of those, chez nous, at our house. Yes. The Hebrew translation of chez nous would be etzlenu.
Mm-hmm. Johnny, I'm fascinated by the pillar of dawn. Is a pillar used as any other part of describing the progression of the hours of the day? I'm only thinking because having read the Aeneid, they repeat over and over again, Virgil does, It was rosy-fingered dawn, as though dawn were with its rose-colored fingers grabbing over the horizon and pulling itself up into the day. This is a lovely metaphor of a pillar, but I can't quite picture it.
Yeah, Sharon, you have just taken me back 50 years. I studied Virgil's Aeneid for my O-levels at age 14. I'm now almost 64. So you've just taken me back 49 years to my studies.
Not as far as I go back in my studies, Johnny.
Yes, the Aeneid. How I remember the Aeneid, Virgil's the Aeneid, beautiful poetry. Amud HaShachar, I find that a beautiful Allah. I like the idea of the Allah Amud HaShachar. The dawn rises, and you have this idea. I mean, what you've just described is that the fingers of dawn, almost like it's being schlepped upwards, isn't it? This pillar of dawn, it rises. It almost gives me the impression of some kind of Hollywood film where you have some special effects where something rises out of the deep, and that's of course what the Amud HaShachar, that's what the dawn does, doesn't it? It rises out of the depths of night, and I think it's a very beautiful expression. The Aeneid, Virgil's Aeneid. I shall go after this shiur. I shall go and take a trip down memory lane and go and have a look at a little bit of it, the Aeneid. Thank you for that. Okay, so etzlo. By the way, just I know this is not a Hebrew grammar or Hebrew language lesson, but I always think it's useful for this. It's a very interesting Hebrew expression, which I did find a little bit amusing when I first heard it. If you want to ask somebody, do you have the keys? In Hebrew, you might think you would say yesh lecha hamaftechot ? You wouldn't. You would say hamaftechot etzlecha, are the keys by you, in that English expression, or shevu. Okay, anyway, enough of that. So enters the dawn, so rises the dawn and enter the Chachmei Yisrael, the wise people of Israel. Amrulo, I'm over here. Can you see the screen? Yeah. Yeah. Amrulo, they said to him, these wise people, Adonenu HaMelech, our master, the king. Adonenu HaMelech. Where have you heard that before?
Addressing God.
Yes, you are. Yes, that's right. Adonenu. It's Hamelech, our master. That's the root of the word Adonai, means literally my master. If you very, very occasionally you will encounter a polite person in Israel, and he might say to you, Adon Lieberman, which means Mr. Lieberman. Very, very it's not very common because most people aren't polite and they just say Lieberman. But Adon Lieberman means Mr. Lieberman. It's my master. Adonenu means my master. You might hear the Chabadnikim using it as well. Morenu Rabbeinu Vadonenu Melech HaMashiach. Our master. So our master, the king. Amcha Yisrael, your people, Israel. Srichin lefarnasa. They need paranasa. Well, we all know what paranasa is, don't we? They need a living. They need to eat. They need sustenance. They need sustenance. So this is basically, they've waited until dawn, and the wise people who are coming to have their daily audience with the king. We mentioned this last week that in the UK, we have the weekly audience of the Prime Minister with the King. This is the equivalent, but it was on a daily basis. These Chachmei Yisrael, these wise people of Israel, came to the King and they said, we're very perturbed. The people are hungry. They need paranasa. So what do you think the King said to them? Amar lahen, the King said to them, let them eat cake. Which, by the way, apparently Marie Antoinette never said. But anyway, basically, this is what he said. He said, Lechu, let them go, v'hit parnasu zeh mizeh. let them get sustenance from one another. It's interesting because this whole next section of Gemarah is translated completely differently in the Steinsaltz as it is from the Art Scroll. It's really interesting. You don't often find that, but there are completely different interpretations given. So we've got the Steinsaltz on the screen. We'll do that first, and then I'll show you what the Art Scroll says, because it's different. It's very interesting. So he says, L'chuvit parnasu zemizeh. Rav Steinsaltz says, provide each other, let them go and provide each other with whatever is lacking. In other words, they all have to muck in. The Art Scroll says, let the wealthy people support the poor. Okay, so David says, I'm not interested. They have to sort it out themselves. Go and sort out some kind of redistribution of wealth. Let the wealthy people support the poor. They should be mefarnes. They should be sustained zemizeh, one from another.
Make a gemach.
Yeah, start a gemach. Yeah, start a gemach. There are people who are rich, people who are poor. We need to redistribute the wealth, says the king. Amrulo, they said to him, Ein hakometz masbia et ha'ari. Let's start with that one. Ein hakometz. What's a kometz? Well, the translation here is a handful. A handful is a kometz. So a handful of food, masbia et ha'ari. Ein hakometz masbia et ha'ari. A handful of food will not satisfy. Where have you had that word masbia? Where do you find that word? Exactly. Poteach et yodecha, open your hands, Hashem, umasbia l'chol chai ratzon. And what does it mean? Satisfy. Satisfy l'chol chai ratzon. To everything that's living according to your will. So, poteach et yodecha umasbia. We also have the same word in Birkat HaMazon, or the same root anyway. Ve'achalta, savata, you shall eat, and you shall be satisfied. Ubeirachta, and you shall bless. Et Hashem Elokecha al haaretz hatova, etc. You shall bless God for everything. So umasbia, sova, is to be satisfied in a food sense. It means to be full, to be satisfied in a food sense. Savata, you've eaten and you're full, you've had your fill, and you are satisfied with the food. We also have that expression, by the way, that when we come to the Korban Pesach, you have to eat it besova. Besova. When we have our Bet HaMikdash again, and when we do our Korban Pesach, we will have to eat that Korban Pesach besova. What does that mean? It means you eat it after you've finished your meal. You might think that the Korban Pesach, that beautiful aromatic roasted lamb turning on a spit, is going to be your main course, but it isn't. The Korban Chagiga is going to be your main course on Pesach. You have to eat the Korban Pesach at the end, besova, when you are satisfied, which is why we have the afikoman. The afikoman, which we eat at the end of the meal, when we are satisfied, that represents the Korban Pesach, as you probably remember. And we have to eat that besova when we are satisfied. I'll tell you a funny story about that, actually. My grandmother, who was not a particularly well-educated lady, but well known for her sense of humor, one year on Pesach, when she had come to us and we'd had a very large Pesach meal in the Seder, and she had eaten her fill. And then we came to the Afikoman. Now, those were the days when we used to have football-sized kazayas, okay? When we used to have an olive size, the size of, a mountain. We had to have 2/3 of a machine-baked matzah, because that's what everybody did in those days. And are you still there, everyone?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, I lost you for a sec. Yeah, so I gave my grandmother this 2/3 of a matzah at the end of this enormous meal that we'd had after dessert. And she turned to me and she says, "You must be bloody joking." And that's exactly how you have to eat the Korban Pesach, Besova, when you're so full that you actually must be bloody joking that you've got to eat another kazayit. Actually, these days, of course, she wouldn't, if she was still here. She would be 115 if she was still here. But she wouldn't have such a problem because, of course, today I personally do not go for a football-sized kazayit. That's another story. Anyway, masbia, hakomets, the handful does not satisfy et ha'ari. What's an ari?
A lion.
A lion, yes. Now, where do you have that word comets? Where do you have that word comets?
In the Kohanim, when they're doing the service in the Beis Hamikdash, they take a handful.
Oh, very good, Avril. Very good. There it is in Parashat Vayikra, chapter 2. It will be on your screen in one moment. There it is on your screen, exactly as Avril has said. You can probably see it there. I'll blue it out so you can see it a bit easier. V'heviu al b'nei ha'kohanim, we're talking about the korban mincha that shall be brought to the sons of Aaron, the kohanim. V'kamatz misham, and they shall, he translates it as scoop out a fistful from there. Melo kumpso, can you see that? Melo kumpso, the fullness of his fist. So it's a fistful, a handful. Misilta, from its fine flour, and mishamna, and from its oil, but alcohol bonata. It's telling you how to do a meal offering. And Avril is absolutely right. The word comets is a small amount, it's a handful, So going back to our Gemarah, a handful of food is not enough for a lion, says these people. Now, there is another translation of the word comets, which I will show you now. Let's go back to the Gemarah, if I can find it. There is another explanation of the comet. A comet comes from the Aramaic word for grasshopper, or as Rabbi Steinsaltz calls it, a locust over there. So it's a small, tiny animal. Maybe it's called a locust, because remember, they ate locusts. Locusts are, certain locusts anyway, are kosher. And so maybe that's called, that's the name for a locust because it's only a handful of food. It's only a small amount of food. Or maybe it's the other way around. I don't know. But the word for a grasshopper or a locust in Aramaic is comet. So you can either say a handful of food is not enough to satisfy a lion, or a grasshopper or a locust is not enough to satisfy a lion. In other words, the meaning is clear, and that is that the wealthy people don't have anywhere enough money or food to feed the poor. And then he gives another metaphor here. Ein habor mitmalei michuliato. Now, this is where we have two interesting, different translations. Here, the Steinsaltz translates that as a cistern will not be filled merely from the rain that falls directly into its mouth, but other water must be channeled in. Now, ein habor, a pit is not, a cistern is not, mitmale is not filled. Me chuliato. What's a chulia? A hole. It's a hole. It's not filled by its hole. Now, Rav Steinsaltz translates that and has to add stuff to it. He says we're talking about a cistern, a water cistern, will not be filled merely from the rain that flows into its mouth. And I would ask, why not? If there's enough rain, then it will get filled. Why not?
No, a cistern doesn't have that big an opening because otherwise it would just all evaporate as well. So it has to be a narrow mouth or surface for the depth.
Okay, I understand that, but why, if there's not enough rain, will it not eventually fill?
Because you're using the water for
water
for something else. You're taking water out.
All right. Okay. Well, this is exactly what Rav Steinsaltz says, and he very helpfully gives us a picture. There you go.
Yeah.
That is Chuliat Habor, the mouth of a cistern. It's a small mound made surrounding its opening. The rainwater that would fall directly into the opening and inside the mouth of the cistern was not ordinarily enough to fill it, as the cistern itself was much wider than its opening, exactly as you've said. Therefore, a system of channels was employed to bring water to the cistern from a much larger area. Okay, so just think about that metaphor. You go and you bring water from a much larger area to fill the cistern. Let me tell you what the art scroll says as a translation for this piece of Gemarah. The art scroll does not understand this as a water system. Listen to this. It says here, a pit cannot be filled from its own dirt. That is, it is impossible to fill an empty pit with earth by digging more earth out of it and casting it back. In this allegory, the pit represented the wealthy people who lacked funds, as a pit lacks earth. Accordingly, the wise men meant to say, the wealthy people cannot afford to support all the poor. So the Steinsaltz translation, as you'll see in a moment, is a much better metaphor, actually, than the art scroll. And you'll see why I say that in a minute. But it's interesting, isn't it, that you've got two completely different understandings of this metaphor. One is that we're talking about a water cistern, and there's not enough, it can't be filled up by its mouth. And the other one is a pit cannot be filled by its own dirt. You dig a pit, dig more earth out of a pit, and you throw it back, it won't fill. Interesting. I found that interesting. So, okay. So David HaMelech says, all right, I understand. My suggestion was that the wealthy people should support the poor people. You're telling me that's not possible. So what else can we do? Well, if you're the king and you need money and you can't ask the wealthy, you can't tax the wealthy, as it were, to pay for the king, to pay for the poor, how then, as the king, are you going to support your people? Suggestions, please.
You have a war and you take land and you loot the land that you conquer.
Yes, you do what the British Empire did and every other empire before. You go into neighboring lands and you pillage their money and materials and people, and you build up your wealth by taking it from others. So that's how it worked. Countries that needed to sustain themselves went on the rampage and invaded next door. And that's what David HaMelech suggests. Where are we? Over here. Amar lahem. Have you got the screen on? Yeah. Amar lahem. The king said to them, Lechu, go, pishtu yedeichem. Literally, stretch out your arms. Pishtu yedeichem. Stretch out your arms. Rav Steinsaltz, interestingly, uses a little bit of poetic license and makes a non-literal translation. He says, go and take up arms with the troops in battle in order to expand our borders and provide our people with the opportunity to earn a livelihood. Now then, that is a very expansive translation of the words that are in the Gemarah. The Gemarah says, Pishtu yadechem bigedud. What's a gedud?
Isn't it a brigade?
It is either a brigade or a battalion. I'm never
Yeah,
sure
whatever.
which is
I
which.
mean, just some formation of
Yeah,
some military formation.
We could do with Philip here because he told us the other day in our Shmuel Aleph Shiur what the word for brigade and what the word for battalion is. And I can't remember which is which, but you're right, Sharon. It is some kind of army formation, either a brigade or a battalion. And so the words literally mean go and stretch out your hand with a battalion. Rav Steinsaltz says something very interesting. He says, go out, take up arms with the troops. Okay, in battle. Don't have any problem with that. And then he adds in, of his own accord, in order to expand our borders and provide our people with the opportunity to earn a livelihood. Now, I see in that, maybe I shouldn't be darshaning Rav Steinsaltz in the same way as you darshan the Gemarah, but I see in that two issues which I don't see in the Gemarah. Number one is I don't see anywhere where it says expand our borders. And if you're going in there as a conquering force and you are taking things off the locals that you've invaded, I think it's a bit of a stretch to call that earning a livelihood. That sounds to me a little bit whitewash.
Well, the soldiers get their money for actually pillaging. That's their reward for fighting in the army.
It doesn't say and provide our soldiers with the opportunity to earn a livelihood, Michael. I think the meaning of Rav Steinsaltz is very clear. I'm just taking a little bit of issue. Maybe I'm being too pedantic here. I can't help it. It's my nature. But I'm taking issue with the word earn a livelihood. Anyway, interestingly, again, the art scroll has a totally different, not totally different, but it has a different approach. The art scroll says as follows. Actually, it is opposite. Steinsaltz says, go out with the troops in order to expand our borders, right? Listen to what the art scroll translates it as. Go stretch forth your hands against the foreign legions in our land. Okay, and there's a footnote that says, during that period, Amalekite legions raided cities in Eretz Israel, looting food supplies and disrupting commerce, as in the time of King Saul. And I'm going to show you right now, I'm going to show you the pasuk in Shmuel Aleph, which we will come to eventually in our share. It's in chapter 30. Chapter 30 of Shmuel Aleph, verses 1 to 18. By this time, David is the king, or at least I think he's the king anyway. Anyway, David and his men came to Ziklag, that on the third day the Amalekites had raided the south and Ziklag, and they had smoked Ziklag and burned it with fire, and presumably everything in it, i.e. the food stores. Now, Ziklag is in Eretz Israel. Let's go down to the end of this, verse 18. And we see here, David rescued all that the Amalekites had taken. Can you see that? David rescued all that the Amalekites had taken. So the art scroll interpretation of our Gemarah is not that David was going out to expand the borders. but that David here was telling the advisors, go and stop the Amalekites or whoever, Plishtim maybe, from raiding our cities in our land. Bit different.
Surely it would have been doing that anyway. I mean, that would be automatic that they would try to stop that. It wouldn't be anything to do with this parable. And is the story not set out elsewhere in other terms, so that maybe Steinsaltz got his interpretation from another version?
I dare say that he's not made it up, I don't think. He will have got it from somewhere. But what's interesting is, yes, let's first deal with your point, Julia. Would he be doing that anyway? Yeah, I mean, I think there would be a certain amount of, sort of guerrilla warfare that would just be going on. But then when it gets to the point where your advisors come in and first thing in the morning at Alot HaShachar, at dawn, and says, hey, king, the people are hungry. The peasants are revolting, and you then have to do something serious about it. This is David saying, well, go and sort them Amalekites out and whoever else is raiding our cities and bleeding us dry. It's a bit like the water companies in the UK. When people are moaning that they have the water bills are going up and there's not enough water and there's a hosepipe ban, they'll say, the government will say to the water companies, go and stop all the leaks that have billions and billions of gallons of water leaking out, which is, you'd say, well, they should be doing that anyway, but they don't until something serious happens and people moan about it. And I think that's what's happened here. But the important thing is this. I'm going to ask David Marks this question because he sort of raised this last week. What's the difference here between the Steinsaltz interpretation and the art scroll interpretation? And why do I prefer the Steinsaltz interpretation to the art scroll interpretation? David,
can I just say, isn't it a different sort of war? One of them is the commanded war because you're defending your land, and the other one you would actually have to have the Sanhedrin, wouldn't you? 71.
Well, that's right. That's what I'm absolutely certain David was about to say. You preempted it.
Sorry, David. Sorry.
No. You're on the ball, and I was going to ask Johnny exactly the same question.
Yeah. So I think we need to ask the art scroll interpretation the question, because what's the whole point of this Gemarah? The whole point of this Gemarah. Let's just get back to the Gemarah again. Where are we?
The art scroll translated Gedud as a troop.
A troop, yes, a troop. Okay, so what's the whole point of this Gemarah? What we're talking about here? We're trying to prove that in a milchemet reshut, a discretionary war, we need the Sanhedrin. And we had something last week. The reason I asked David that question was because he pointed out last week that there was a problem with the whole approach we had last time. Because last week with Rab Al-Bahu's interpretation, which was the appointment of Joshua, Joshua's war was certainly not a discretionary war. That was definitely a milchemet mitzvah. Now, if we take the art scroll interpretation of this pasuk, this is not a discretionary war. A discretionary war is a war which goes out to expand your borders. And that is why Rav Steinsaltz has taken upon it himself to give us the explanation to clarify that this is talking about, what was David talking about? He was talking about going out and expanding the empire. And therefore, I think that the explanation of Rav Steinsaltz on this Lechu Pishtu Yidechem Bigdud fits much better than the art scroll, because with the art scroll explanation, we have the same question that we had last week, which is you're talking about the wrong kind of war, as Avril and David have pointed out.
And it fits with this metaphor, doesn't it, about the system and that you're going further out. I mean,
correct. That's correct. That's what I was coming back to. Remember, I said a few minutes ago, you'll see in a minute why I think that Rav Steinsaltz's metaphor is different to the art scroll metaphor. If you think about it, Rav Steinsaltz's metaphor fits with his interpretation because the cistern needs to be filled by channels that brings water from afar. Whereas the art scroll's interpretation of the pit digging out its own soil and not being enough fits with the art scroll saying it's in our own land that the problem lies. The only problem is that the art scroll has this problem of it's the wrong kind of war. So I think that's really, really interesting that, you know, you learn that Gemara. What you do if you don't have either a Steinsaltz or an art scroll, and you don't have a teacher who has got an art scroll or a Steinsaltz, I wonder how. I really know, a serious question. I never learned Gemarah Sanhedrin with my Gemara Rebbe, but I just wonder how this is learned in yeshivas, where the boys who they're meant to learn this on their own between them, and they're not allowed a Steinsaltz and they're not allowed an art scroll. They've only got Rashi, Tosfos, and all the Meforshim. Be interesting to see what what I used to call the small print in the back of the Gemara, all the different explanations in the Gemara, which unfortunately my level of learning Gemara back in the day did not stretch any further than what was on the page, which was Rashi and Tosfos.
Johnny, I have a question.
Yeah.
My understanding is that Art Scroll has its own political agenda, not only political about its relationship to Israel and Zionism, but also has a political agenda within Jewish conversations and levels or streams of orthodoxy. So I guess I would ask that we look at find out what is the agenda item here.
I think you're right, Sharon. There's no question that you're right. I don't think you're right. I absolutely know you're right. That Art Scroll does have a political agenda, I am the first to point out when there is what I call an Art Scroll whitewash. I personally, though, on this particular point, I don't see an agenda with their particular interpretation as opposed to the interpretation taken by Steinsaltz. It would be very interesting, and maybe I will try, I'm not promising, maybe I'll try and have a look at some of those commentaries in the back of the Big Boys Gemara and see if any of those shed some light on it. But I do see a very interesting difference here between Rav Steinsaltz, who's also, by the way, had a political agenda, a different political agenda to Art Scroll, and that's therefore not surprising that on occasions there will be difference of opinion in interpretation. But I think that the point that Sharon makes is a very good broad point, and that is that whatever you read, there is always a danger that you are reading something which has the author's political agenda sewn into it. It's inevitable. When I write my Divrei Torah for Tchelet or for the timetable every week, of course I've got my political agenda. Of course I've got my own religious agenda and my own particular view of things, and so that's bound to come through. It's inevitable in any author of anything, really. You're going to have I think it's almost inevitable. But it's interesting to see here that there are these differences of opinions. It'd be interesting also. These people who wrote the Art Scroll were, whatever their political views, they were certainly very, very clever people, and they will also, I am sure, have understood that their explanation leaves them with a problem as to which kind of war it is. And it'd be interesting to know how they deal with that, but I haven't seen anything on it. Anyway, yes,
Johnny, I feel that's slightly unfair because to give them credit, Art Scroll here in that note that you just read do quote a source for their interpretation, so they haven't made it up.
No. I said that, David. I said I'm sure they haven't made it up. They will have their sources.
And by quoting this source, who's probably an Acharon, it's not a contemporary source where there would be a political agenda. And I'm sure you're right that if this kind of problem were to come up in a serious yeshiva, well, first of all, as you've said many times before, when they would go through psukim from Tanakh, they just gloss over it because you don't learn Tanakh from Gemarah or Gemarah from Tanakh. But I'm sure that someone like the Maharsha and the other Mephorshim at the back of the Gemarah, as you suggested, would deal with this particular issue, and it would be raised in a serious discussion in a yeshiva.
Can I ask if Avril is definitely right? For instance, if it is just a few skirmishes, people coming over the border, it doesn't necessarily mean it's a justified mandatory war that just to get rid of a few people coming over and causing trouble. It's not an attack, and therefore it may well be that it's an optional war.
Oh, I don't know about that, Julie. I mean, somebody's coming in and burning your cities like Ziklag, and I think that's would be considered a defensive war, to go and sort them out if they're coming out.
Not only that,
just allow them to come in and burn cities down.
Not only that, we're dealing with Amalek, and it's we are mechayev min haTorah to destroy Amalek.
Ah, there's a point. There's a point. Although you could argue. Oh no, it does say the footnote does say Amalekite legions, and where I showed you in Tanakh is Amalek, and of course David's absolutely right. Amalek, there's no question about that. Amalek is definitely a milchemet mitzvah. That's or a milchemet chovah, depending on which way you call it. That's a very good point. It'd be interesting to see. I mean, that footnote in Art Scroll quotes a source called Margalios Hayam. It would be interesting. I mean, these people were geniuses. They weren't nobodies. They will, of course, have thought of this question, and it will be very interesting to know how they deal with this answer. But I find it fascinating that Rav Steinsaltz, who doesn't quote a source for what he's saying, has a completely different view, which makes it more understandable for us, at least, because we're meant to be talking about a war that expands the borders. And he has used that expression, expand our borders, I'm sure deliberately, because he knows that we are talking about a milchemet reshut. It's just a very interesting side point that, we've spent, 20 minutes just on this one little tiny thing, which is why, for me personally, Daf Yomi, I find it very, very difficult, because I personally find it very unsatisfactory because everything is so rushed. But that's just my obsessional nature, I guess. Right. So David says, go and take up arms and either go and expand our borders, Al-Pi Steinsaltz, or go and sort out the raiders who are raiding our cities. So what do the wise people, the Prime Minister and his entourage do? Now we're getting to the nitty-gritty of why we've brought this whole story of the alarm clock and the whole business. Miyad, immediately, Yoatzin ba'Achitophel. They sought advice from Achitophel. We'll have a look in a minute who he was. V'nimlachin b'Sanhedrin. And they consulted the Sanhedrin. V'shoalin, and they asked the Urim v'Tumim, and they asked the Urim v'Tumim, the lights on the breastplate, the stones on the breastplate of the Kohen Gadol. Okay, this is what the Gemarah says. So David says, basically, the story is this. David wakes up, learns some Torah. The Prime Minister comes in and says, the people are hungry. David says, let the wealthy people feed them. They say, no, there isn't enough. David says, well, go to war then. So then they say, okay, well, if we're going to war, we need to go through the correct procedure. And the correct procedure is to take advice from Achitophel, to consult with the Sanhedrin, and ask the Urim V'Turim. 3 things they have to do. And you can see why they brought this, because what are we trying to prove? We're trying to prove that we need the permission of the Sanhedrin. And this clearly says we have to consult the Sanhedrin. But Rav Yosef is not satisfied. Amar Rav Yosef says, wait a minute, you just made that up. I want a scriptural proof. My kra. Where is the scriptural proof for what you've just told me? How do I know that they took advice from Achitophel, they consulted the Sanhedrin, and they asked the Urim V'Tumim? How do I know that? You just made it up, as far as I know. And they say, no, there is a pasuk. And we now go over the page. Oh, well, let's go beforehand to Achitophel. Achitophel began his career as an advisor to King David, but switched allegiances to David's son Avshalom during the latter's rebellion. Achitophel was from the village of Gilo, south of ancient Jerusalem, and was well known as an infallible advisor. Now, I'm going to show you a pasuk that says, the text says, and I'm going to show you this in a minute, asking advice of Achitophel was tantamount to asking God. Now that's interesting, isn't it? That's a very big claim. Let's have a look at the pasuk. It's in Shmuel Bet chapter 16. Shmuel Bet chapter 16. Let me get it up. I've got it up here. There it is. Share the screen.
Why didn't they go straight to the Sanhedrin?
Oh, Sanhedrin we're coming to in a minute.
Oh.
Atzat Achitophel, the advice of Achitophel, Asher Ya'atz Bayamim Ahain, where he gave advice. By the way, the modern Hebrew word for an advisor, anyone know? Yoetz, or if it's a female advisor, a yoetzet. Ever heard the expression yoetzet halacha? That is the name for a lady who has not been given the title rabbi for whatever political or halachic reasons, but who advises on halacha. And she's given the title in certain circles, in the Dati Leumi world, she's given the entitled Yoetzet Halacha, somebody who advises on halacha. So a Yoetz is an advisor, a Yoetzet is a female advisor. So this Achitophel, who was advising in those days, Ka'asher Yishal Ish Bidvar HaElohim. It's as if a man had inquired of the word of God. So this guy, his advice was clearly of the highest caliber. So that's why in our Gemarah, they go and ask Achitophel. He's a very wise person. He's the guy that's giving out good advice. It's as if you're asking God. Let's go back to the Gemarah. Now, look what the Steinsaltz tells us. Very interesting. Ironically, in modern Hebrew, the phrase advice of Achitophel, atzat Achitophel, means poor advice, which is the direct opposite of the original biblical term. It's a piece of irony. So if somebody gives you duff advice, that is known as atzat Achitophel, means the advice of Achitophel, which in biblical terms means it's like asking God. It's the highest, the best advice you can get. Here it's sarcastic. In modern Hebrew, it's used as sarcasm almost. Huh, that was great advice, I don't think. So that's interesting, just a piece of, I didn't know that, by the way. I've never heard that expression, but that's what it seems to be. Right, so we're over the page. Now, how do we know? Remember, what we've just asked is, Rav Yosef says, I need scriptural proof for this idea that we asked Achitophel, and then the Sanhedrin, and then the Urim V'Turim. He brings a pasuk from Divrei Hayamim, from Chronicles, which says this, and it is a very, very tenuous proof, if you ask me, but there you go. That's just my view. The verse says, "V'acharei Achitophel," and after Achitophel, Benayahu ben Yehoyada, ve'Evyatar, v'Sar Tzava lamelech Yoav, and the general of the king's army, Yoav. Literally, the pasuk says, and after Achitophel was Benaiah, son of Yehoyada, and Evyatar, and the general of the king's army was Yoav. What on earth is this talking about? Well, we need to go to the pasuk. And just to sort of stress what David said just now, if you're learning this in the Gemara, and you do not go to Divrei Hayamim Aleph and look at chapter 27:34, you will have no idea what this Gemara is talking about. And so you cannot learn this Gemara without going to the Psukim. And that's just a fact. And so therefore, there is a big problem the way Gemara is learned and taught.
Well, was Chronicles written before this?
No, Chronicles was written. Yes, it was written before the Gemara.
Yeah,
but it was written after the time of David HaMelech, but long before the Gemara.
After the time of David HaMelech.
Yeah, it was written. Chronicles, Divrei Hayamim, was written right at the end of the. It's the last book of Tanakh, basically. Let's go to the Psukim. Let me take you to this pasuk, and I can see that we're out of time, so we'll just do this and stop.
But these rabbis would have known that, wouldn't they? If they've done if they've read Chronicles.
Yeah, the rabbis did, but the people learning Gemara today don't learn. We learn Divrei Hayamim.
Yeah.
Which yeshiva bochurim know Divrei Hayamim? None. Maybe the ones in the Gush, but that's about it. Anyway, so what is Divrei Hayamim? It's exactly what it says on the tin, translated in English as Chronicles. What are Chronicles?
Words of the day.
Divrei Hayamim, words of the day, exactly. They are an account of what went on. It's a history book. Divrei Hayamim, Chronicles. Okay, what are Chronicles? The Chronicles of King David means the stories about King David, all that went on in his life. So this is talking about who's got what job. Okay, this is what this particular chapter is talking about. We've got here who was who. It's a who's who. Of Dan was Azriel, the son of Yerocham. These were the leaders of the tribes of Israel. And then Yoav commenced to count. We didn't finish. And we come over here. And over the cattle was Shirtai. That was his job. He was in charge of cattle. He was the minister of agriculture. Over the camels was Obil the Ishmaelite. He was the minister for camels, etc., etc. And Achitophel, verse 33, Achitophel was the king's counselor, and Hushai, the Archite, was the king's companion. After Achitophel were Yehoyada, the son of Benaiah, and Evyatar. And the general of the king's army was Yoav. This is our pasuk that has just been quoted. So in its context, what is this telling you? This is telling you that Yehoyada, the son of Benaiah, was Achitophel's successor as advisor to the king. This whole chapter is about who had what job. Achitophel was the king's counselor, and after Achitophel were Yehoyada, the son of Benaiah, and Evyatar. So what's that got to do with us in our subject? And the general of the king's army, that's another job, was Yoav. So we're going to stop there because that's our cliffhanger. What on earth is this pasuk, which is merely in its context telling us what job these people had and when they came in the pecking order, Achitophel was first, and then after him, he was taken over by Jehoiada, the son of Benaiah, and then after him, Evyatar. And by the way, the general of the king's army was Joab. And this pasuk is brought by our Gemarah to prove this whole story of David waking up in the night and having this conversation, and then going to go out to war on the basis of taking advice from Achitophel, Sanhedrin, and the Urim V'Tumim. Where do you get that from this pasuk? You don't, just on a superficial reading. There's no way you can do that. You need the Gemarah to explain it, and that's what we will do next week. Okay. If you don't want to have a spoiler, don't read on. If you do want to have a spoiler, read on. I will try and find something in the Big Boys Gemarah at the back to see if we can answer the question that we've got about the Art Scroll interpretation of the skirmishes, as Julia called them, and we'll see if we can find something for that for next week as well. But for next week, we have to explain what this pasuk, which at first glance has absolutely nothing to do with what we're talking about, how it fits into our Gemarah, and we will do that, please God, next week. Any questions on today's offering? Okay.
I
Yes,
just
Julia.
wanted to say that I have looked on, and I can see that there's lots of grounds for queries in the and I think we've got to revisit that passage that you've just read and have another look at it.
Yes, we will
examine it.
We'll start with that again next week. We will go. This is just for my benefit when I look at the end of this share for next week's preparation. We will begin with the pasuk in Divrei Hayamim, chapter 27, verse 34, and then we will apply it to our Gemarah. And yes, you're right, Julia. You will have many questions.
The problem that I have is that I don't know, I'm going to be abroad. I hope that I can catch into the next exciting installment.
We hope you can too. If not, then send us your questions on the group, and we'll see if we can deal with them. Okay,